Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner. Chapter 14. Nature of Flames. Fate followed the long tail of Edek that slid heavily across the polished floors like a gigantic snake as they made their way back towards the camp. Preoccupied with her thoughts, she walked in silence and was only vaguely aware of the drake. As such, she failed to notice the violet hues that emerged from the water caverns as they tickled the last rays of light from the day. Edek occasionally tossed a bronzy glance back at Fate, but powered onward, content not to disturb the peace. Fate startled slightly when she felt her toes kick something. She looked down to see a small radish bounce away from her, hopping quickly across the floor. How peculiar, she thought. Lifting her head, she noticed they had arrived back at camp. The area they had made for camp was a large room. One end overlooked the vastness of the waters of Yulefrond, and at the other end it contained a small section, a closed-off room that served its purpose as domiciles. Like everything else in the caverns, this room was expertly carved from the living stone and polished to the quality of glass. Fate watched the tip of Edek's tail disappear around a heavy curtained archway that separated the sleeping quarters, a series of individual alcoves where all of their gear had been stowed. Fate hoisted her misshapen bundle of clothing and pushed haphazardly through the thick, dark blue curtain. She was eager to dry off fully and get back into her warm cloak. The high caverns of the mountains seemed to hold a persistent chill no matter where she went. Whoa, whoa, stop! Multiple shouts assailed Fate as soon as she had pushed herself through the heavy archway. Fate drew up sharp. Breathing heavily, she looked all around the room in a panic. Prince Felix was on his feet. He and Fletch were standing across the room next to a large, misshapen sack. But, aside from that, nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. What's wrong? Fate asked quickly. Fate watched as the prince drew in a sharp breath, held it, and then lobbed a potato high into the air. The spud flew in a graceful arc, then bounced heavily off the rim of a great black pot with a dismal clang. Ah! Felix and Fletch groaned in unison. The loose potato rolled slowly across the floor and came to rest next to Edek. The drake, who laid at the opposite wall, stretched forth his great head to sniff interestedly at the russet tuber. Ha! Sorry, lad. Gonna have to do better than that. Fletch chastised him mockingly. Fate examined the room more closely. Vegetables were strewn all over the floor, and roughly at the center of their dispersion stood the huge black pot. Come on, it dinged the rim. That must count for something, Felix argued disappointedly. We should add a rule. Fate bristled with indignation and headed straight for Fletch. I see you're up, she said almost accusatorily as she passed Felix before confronting Fletch. I thought you were making dinner. She reached up and yanked a lock of fur at the back of his head. Not chucking it about. Hey, Fletch exclaimed as he danced away from her groping paws. We figured you'd be at least another hour. Felix looked on with an uncertain grin. Fate let out an annoyed sound. I don't take that long, she deflected hotly. However, she did notice that Fletch had managed to work the matted fur free from around his ears, so that was something at least. She gathered her escaping bundle of clothes and stalked toward one of the curtained alcoves where her gear and pack were stowed. A sharp slap cracked upon the air. A potato rocketed across the room with the force of a cannonball. Fate screamed and ducked as the potato hit the wall and exploded into a cacophony of sputtered tatters. She whirled around to see Edek's eyes wide with shock. He had an intense, guilty look upon his face as his tail slowly recoiled back towards him. Fletch and Felix burst into gales of laughter. Edek was shiftily looking anywhere except Fate's direction or the cooking pot. Can you not? Fate shook her head in utter disbelief. Then she stalked into her alcove. The inside of the alcove was not large, an individual space that allowed for privacy by pulling a thick curtain across the doorway. The small area had a place to lay down upon, a stone slab with a shallow curving cut in the face. Folded against the wall and awaiting to be placed upon the slab was a thick mattress. Fate placed her bundle down and reached out to touch the mattress. Unfolding it slightly, she found a pillow inside. Fate took the pillow and, much to her surprise, found it was stuffed with feathers. She pressed it to her face with joy and drew in a long, relaxing breath, which she held for a moment, then released, along with some of the tension that had been nagging at the back of her brain. The idea of sleeping on anything that wasn't the ground, and with a modicum of comfort, was a prospect she was much looking forward to. Fate put the pillow back and pulled her pack across the floor to her. She rummaged inside, pulling out all of her gear and extra clothes. Then she arranged and organized them upon the stone bed. The gear she placed to one side and focused on her garments with a critical eye. They were a shabby lot. The long trail had taken its toll upon them. They were weather-stained, dirty, and ripped in numerous places. Only her jacket and cloak had been hardy enough to withstand the hardships. She much disliked the idea of putting on dirty clothes, now that she was clean, for once. But having lost her extra shirt, she didn't really have much of a choice. She chose the best of the bunch and beat away what dirt she could, resolving to sneak away the first chance she got to clean them properly in one of the pools. Fate took off Fletch's borrowed shirt and dressed with her own garments. Now that night was upon them, the caverns held more than a shadow of a chill, so she took her cloak and wrapped it haphazardly around herself like a shawl. Fate glanced somewhat longingly at the bundled mattress. Weariness tugged at her, but her stomach felt hollow, and she knew she would sleep all the better after a meal. Heaving a long sigh, thick with the day's hardships, she turned and pushed through the divided curtain to rejoin the others. When Soraya had first shown them the domicile area, Fate had not noticed a small pantry tucked away at the back of the room, having been more concerned with Felix's condition at the time. Now she wandered over to it and peered into the depths. It was not an overly large pantry, but was lined from floor to ceiling with shelves, and at the far end of the room she could dimly see another door which led to an unknown area. The pantry seemed to be decently stocked with dried meats, salted fish, pickled vegetables, and preserved fruits, which were sealed with wax in red crockery jars. Aside from the long store goods, which did not spoil easily, there were recently acquired provisions, such as the sack of assorted vegetables that now sat next to Fletch. The fox had patrolled the room while she had been away and collected the wayward food. Now he was pulling one vegetable after the other from the stack before carefully skinning, slicing, coring, splitting, or quartering, whichever preparatory demand came to Paul, before they were dumped into the cooking pot. The large cast-iron pot, which had been the source of Felix and Fletch's amusement, was still in the middle of the room, but now it was suspended on a tripod structure made of thin iron rods, and it hung over a mound of fresh firewood, where a few tiny red flames licked at its bottom. Fate groaned. The hollow feeling inside of her stomach intensified as she watched Fletch work. She knew it would easily be an hour before anything was eaten from that pot. Instead, she looked back into the almost dark pantry. Despair came over her. She really didn't feel like shuffling around sealed jars and tightly wrapped packages just for a morsel of food. She looked back at Fletch. Intercepting a raw vegetable before it found the pot seemed viable, so she slowly made her way towards him. "Hey, Fate?" Felix had just stuck his stiff-eared head from around the curtain of his own alcove. Fate stopped and looked at him. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Felix said. "Give me a moment." His head disappeared, and the sound of rustling came from behind his curtain. Then the prince ducked out from beneath it and stepped up to Fate. "What is it?" Fate asked. "Is everything all right? Are you feeling okay?" She cast a worried look across the prince. "I can hardly believe you're even standing. Usually healing wipes a person out. Are you sure you're not feeling some effects after Soraya's technique?" "What?" No, I feel fine. Better than fine. The prince paused, thinking. I feel like a heavy pack has been lifted off my shoulders. Or perhaps... He paused again, searching for the right words. You know that feeling when your tutor is looking over your shoulder, but then they finally leave and you feel like you can breathe again? It's a little bit like that. Okay. Still, go easy for a bit, won't you? Fate pleaded. Nah, don't worry yourself. Anyway, Felix produced the sword he was carrying, the long sword with the cobalt scabbard. This is what I wanted to show you. I was wondering if you know what this is. Let's see. Is it a sword? Fate said in a mocking guess, but glared down at the blade with venom. It almost killed me if I recall. Cheeky, Felix replied. Well then, no. I don't guess I do. Outside of it being a decent blade, I can tell that much. It does seem to be too nice for a mercenary's blade, and that does make me wonder exactly who those wolves could have been. I think I can answer that for you. Felix slowly drew the blade from the nicked and battered scabbard and held it up to the light of the ever-growing flames of the fire. Felix twisted the blade so that the inlaid patterns of crashing waves shone clearly in the firelight. Then he offered the blade out to Fate. Fate cocked her head to the side, then lifted the sword carefully from Felix with both paws. The wolf that had this, Felix prompted. He was large, with a blackish coat. Fate thought about the desperate struggle against the huge wolf in the snow. She felt a sharp tingle run through her paws and couldn't help but shudder at the memory of the blade slicing into her. Near enough, Fate answered. But all wolves, or foxes, most everyone for that matter, is large by my comparison. She twisted slightly on the spot, examining the sword's fine crossguard, and her slender frame seemed most prominent in that moment. Right, Felix chuckled softly. Well, this sword is named Torrent. It is a blade from my family. You might even call it a royal sword, I suppose. My father gave it to his brother, my Uncle Ironpaw, when disputes broke out along our southern borders with the Sierra Pack. Felix closed his eyes for a moment, and a small smile crested on his face. My uncle was one of the best fighters I've ever seen. My father wanted his brother armed with the very best weapon, so he had this blade commissioned. Felix's smile turned to a sad grimace. It did not help him in the end. He fell to a wolf named Wrath Longfang. That's horrible. I'm very sorry, Fate said sincerely. Do you think this mercenary was the same wolf, this Wrath? Although it would be hasty to jump to conclusions, the sword could have been stolen or sold. No, I'm confident it was him. The sword, it still had Uncle's... Felix faltered, his face twisted in a disgusted frown. Then he cleared his throat. It was the same wolf. His tone spoke of certainty, but it was obvious he was unwilling to clarify why. It was him and his pack. They were the ones who pursued me before. The prince hung his head. I am sorry. I put you all in danger. Fate was watching the prince closely. It doesn't matter now. It's over, she said. It does matter, Felix said with gritted teeth. When I first met Wrath, I was too weak to avenge my uncle. I tried, and I failed. I ran. Felix looked very agitated. He was glaring daggers into the floor. He bested me. I have to live with that failure. Felix looked up at Fate with admiration. But he didn't best you. You did a great service to the royal family, and you didn't even know it. He smiled a weak smile. So, by all of the laws of the land, and by rights of the spoils of war, Torrent is yours now. May it ever be swift as the river flows. Felix made the traditional former gesture of Landor, sweeping out his arm, then twisting his paw gracefully as he brought it to rest on his chest, just above his heart. Thank you for what you did for my family. May this be an heirloom for you and yours, forevermore. Fate was surprised at the formality of her companion, and she looked at the long sword with a new respect. It was a fine weapon indeed. She dropped her cloak and stepped away from Felix. She took the blade through a few basic forms. It's surprisingly light, she said to Felix. Aye, the blade is made of aspen steel, forged in the White Mountains. Their smiths guard their secrets rather jealously. Felix scoffed and rolled his eyes. The price less so. They definitely know the value of their metal. But the quality can't be denied. It is unparalleled. Fate shared a glance with Fletch. White Mountains? She muttered. Fletch nodded, his eyebrows raised. Sunder, he replied. Fate ran her fingers along the flat length of the blade, across the engraving, feeling the waves of steel pass under her fingers. It's very long, she observed. Silver Sword is nearly as long as he is tall, Fletch commented. You could not wish for hardier steel. True, but Master Silver is 3 times stronger than I am too. Fate shifted her grip, examining the fine engraving once more. It is very beautiful. Yet, I think I know where my strengths lay. She flipped the blade around, carefully avoiding the edge, and offered the acorn pommel out to the prince. Even if I were to practice, I feel this is better suited for someone like you, Felix. You have the reach and the muscle for it. What? Felix asked, shocked. You're serious? Completely serious. Fate motioned more incessantly with the sword. Also, I am happy I can return what was taken. But... Felix stammered, as Fate relinquished the blade to him. You'll need to get a feel for it. A bastard sword is a little more unwieldy than the arming sword you've been carrying, Fate said, and this thing is uncommonly lightweight, so it might catch you off guard. I'm sure Fletch will be able to take you through the major forms. The prince's eyes swelled with emotion as he carefully slid the blade back into the blue and battered scabbard. I don't know what to say. He looked up at Fate. Then he suddenly embraced her. Thank you. Fate was slightly stunned, half swallowed by the prince's arms. She locked eyes with Fletch. A bemused grin slowly broke across her face. The fox flashed back his wiry grin and shook his head slightly. Fate patted Felix on the back, returning the impromptu hug with grace. Edek's huge head lowered towards Fletch. Why are they making such commotion over the Iron Claw? He asked in shuddered tones. It's a bunny thing, Fletch whispered back. Edek lifted his head away, still watching curiously. Fate and Felix broke apart. In a strained voice, the prince said, I swear I'll be worthy of it. Of course you will, Fate said bracingly. Just don't lop off an ear. They're much harder to reattach than you might think. Right, Felix chuckled. He looked slightly abashed, and his eyes were still overbright as he wandered towards his alcove, cradling the magnificent blade. I'm so hungry, Fate said, rounding on Fletch. What have you been doing with that pot, huh? Calm yourself, Fletch deflected. It'll be a while still. Fate grumbled audibly. Scooping her cloak off the ground, she draped it about her shoulders and sat down in a huff. The fire crackled slowly, and the water in the pot bubbled tantalizingly. Suddenly, Edek's head shot straight up in alarm. His snout twisted around to stare towards the door. His large nostrils dilated with huge, deep breaths as he scented the air. Fate and Fletch both looked the direction the drake was pointed. They had learned long ago that Edek's warnings were never false. A soft, tinkling sound preceded Soraya, who seemed to materialize from the shadows like a white specter. Fletch stood up quickly. "Lady Soraya," he said. "Did I alarm you?" Soraya asked in her silky voice. "My apologies." "Oh, shave my tail," Fate cursed. "I completely forgot. I asked Soraya to join us tonight." "Yes, of course," Fletch said nobly. "It would be our honor." He motioned welcomingly. "Please." Soraya inclined her head and proceeded into the camp. With her, she brought an incredibly large demijohn wrapped with a wicker weave that was half as big as Fate was tall. Despite the size of the large carafe, Soraya did not seem to have any trouble with the weight, and it was clearly full of a dark liquid. She placed her load down and looked around the dim room, sparing each of them in turn a mystical glance from her strange eyes. "It's so dark," Soraya observed. "You have neglected the starfires." "Starfires?" Fate asked curiously, glancing at Fletch, then back to Soraya. "What are starfires?" Soraya smiled and moved towards one of the stone walls. Upon it there was a hanging bracket that had been cloaked by the ever-enclosing shadows. Soraya reached up and relieved the bracket of its black satin covering. Underneath was an intricate tangle of iron-wrought wires that held a teardrop-shaped globe of crystal. Fate felt Soraya reach for the light, then directed a small stream of it towards the teardrop crystal. The globe flared to life. It radiated a soft white glow to the dark room, just like a pale star in the night sky. They watched in awe as the light moved around the solid globe of crystal. Being entirely smooth, the globe had no facets which to direct the light it held, so instead it redirected itself in a perpetual motion. "Amazing," Fate whispered. "I've never seen a lithium crystal react like that before. We should get one. That could be incredibly useful." "Yes," Soraya said, moving on to the next bracketed lantern. She uncovered it and directed a flow of light into it. "They are very useful, but I am afraid they are too fragile for common use. Any nick or blemish to the surface, and the light can escape. So carrying one around usually results in frustration instead of convenience." "Oh," Fate said crestfallen, "that is a shame." "These will last a few hours," Soraya explained. "When you're ready to sleep, just cover them over again with the shade." Soraya was now lighting the last lantern, which was bracketed very close to Edek's long tail. "That is, if you're not too busy to sleep," she said in an offhand manner, but suddenly Edek gave a sharp jump where he lay, his rough scales scratching noisily upon the stone floor. Neither Fate nor Fletch had really seen what had happened to the drake, but as the starfire came to full life, driving the last of the shadows away, they noticed the bronze drake was staring haughtily in the direction of Soraya. His jaws were slightly apart, and he had the strangest expression carved upon his face. Soraya, by contrast, seemed to have noticed nothing at all, and proceeded to walk gracefully towards the pantry door. "Hey, Fletch, do you think we might be able to repair—" Felix was removing himself from his alcove when he came up short, face to face with Soraya. "Oh, it's you," he said, surprised. "Good evening," Soraya said, looking over the prince with an appraising eye. "Are you feeling well?" Felix licked his lips nervously. "Yes, I think I feel all right." "That is well," Soraya said. "If you do start to feel ill, be sure to speak with Fate. She should be able to help if dizziness or fatigue takes you. That can sometimes happen." Yes, I will," Felix said, edging slowly towards the bubbling pot at the center of the room. Then he took a seat next to Fletch. Soraya watched the prince go. Then she turned and headed into the depths of the pantry. A clattering and shuffling of goods could be heard from within. When next she appeared, she held in her hands an extremely large bowl with 4 glazed and fired earthenware mugs inside. She walked over to where she had left the absurdly large demijohn and placed the bowl on the floor. She knelt and separated the mugs from the bowl. "I felt this might be a proper time for this," Soraya said, removing the stopper from the demijohn. "If the last few years are any indication, the pilgrimages to Yulfrond will be scarce going forward." She began to pour, and a dark crimson liquid came forth from the carafe. First, she filled the large bowl and set aside the demijohn. Then she dipped each of the mugs into the liquid, filling them. She offered the first of the mugs to Fletch, who took it with a word of thanks, then passed one to each of them in turn. Once the mugs were distributed, Soraya carefully carried the bowl to where Edek lay. She knelt gracefully before the large drake and placed the bowl on the ground before him. She proceeded to fill the large bowl to its brim once more. "None shall be left wanting," she said, staring at Edek. "I hope this lifts your many worries." Soraya rose gracefully and returned to her place by the fire. She sat down with her long legs tucked under her. Her silken robes flowed lightly to the ground in gentle folds, and her elegant tail rested upon them. She carefully picked up her own mug and rested it in her lap. Silence prevailed, now that Soraya had finished with the mugs and settled herself. The fire twinkled, crackled, and hissed as the stew bubbled, frothed, and simmered. But for a long time, that was the only sound or movement. Fate, desperately hungry and for something to do, lifted her mug to her lips and drank. "By the fury!" she coughed. "That is strong." As if Fate's exclamation was a call to action, the rest of them took a draught from their mugs. "Oh, you're right," Fletch said, running his tongue in and out of his mouth. "It has a very nutty aftertaste." The prince took his goblet and sniffed eagerly at the aroma, savoring it before he took a drink. "So sweet," he observed after his first draught. The prince turned to Soraya. "How did you get wine like this?" he asked. "Surely grapes don't grow this high up on the mountain?" "I am allowed to leave, you know," Soraya said coolly. Fate couldn't help but let out a cheerful laugh. She could feel the warmth of the wine spreading through her body. Fletch likewise had a twinkle of mirth in his eye, but contained his own laugh. The prince rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. That was a stupid question," Felix said, clearly abashed. "Questions are not stupid," Soraya said calmly. "The lack of thought before the question is loosed is usually to fault." "Well spoken." Edek had just lifted his own nose from the depths of his bowl of wine. He blinked in surprise, then looked down at the bowl in front of him, almost angrily. His eyes were molten copper in the firelight, and they flicked in the direction of Soraya once, before he retreated back to his aloof manner. Soraya had a pleasant smile upon her face that revealed the sharp tips of her longer teeth as she looked at Edek. "Lady Soraya," Fletch asked, "have you known many Lightbearers in your time? You said that more used to visit the mountain." Soraya turned back to the group at large. "A fair few, I dare say." She took a sip from her mug. "I have not always lived here. At one time I wandered the country, much like you and your friends, attending to whatever the Lightkeepers felt needed placation. Your kind tend to think me ancient, brought on as a result of living in such a secluded place, I'd wager." She turned her head and looked over at Edek. "But I doubt I'm hardly older than Edek, if his horns are any judge of age." Edek shifted slightly under the appraisal, but merely dipped his nose back into his quickly emptying bowl of wine. Fate felt completely shocked as a revelation happened to occur to her at these words. She had no notion of how old Edek actually was. She tried to think back through their history together, but the only thing she could remember was the first time that she had met the Drake. Master Silver had introduced them to Edek and bid them train and learn from him. Back then he had already been a large Drake. She cast a critical eye over Edek, covering her obvious curiosity with a sip of wine. Yes, he was definitely larger now than he had been back then. His chest was almost certainly deeper and broader, and as Soraya had correctly pointed out, the clearest indication was evident in the length and curve of his horns. Fate made a mental note to ask Fletch what he knew once they were alone. She could almost certainly tell that was the type of subject that would come under the stubborn, prideful part of Edek that wouldn't get an answer if she deigned to ask him directly. Soraya was still speaking. After the temple at Althern was complete, my skill with water technique had grown during my wanderings, and the Lightkeepers bid me come live here. Their thinking was that it might be the best place for my skills to thrive, and it was also close enough to send any likely trainee Lightbearers who showed extraordinary promise in the healing arts. So, the waters of Yulfron, then? Fletch asked. Their healing qualities are spoken about all over the country. Are they naturally special, or is their enchantment actually just you? Soraya thought for a moment, swirling the contents of her mug. That is an interesting question, she said slowly. Well, it must be one or the other, Felix stated with a cocksure smile. Soraya looked at him with a pointed stare. Does a fish swim, or does it fly under the sea? She asked. The prince gaped at her as she took a long drink, eyebrows raised. She lowered her mug and faced Fletch. That is not the answer you are looking for, but it is the best answer I can give you. I do not wish to be cryptic, but it is not so straightforward. Her head turned towards the dark opening at the far side of the room, where the vista looked out over the waters below. They were completely hidden in the pitch darkness, but the faint trickling sound of the waters could still be heard over the noise of the fire. While I've been here, I have been able to help cases what seemed hopeless otherwise. But I am not arrogant enough to think that it's just because of me. One thing seems to hold true, however. When the light watches over these waters, a great many things are possible. She transitioned her gaze to Felix, holding him under her stare for a long while. Felix met her gaze for only a moment before looking instead into the twisting flames of the fire. His brows drew down in concentration, then his back stiffened. I have another question, Felix stated, and this one I've thought about for a long time. He pulled from the pouch at his waist the crimson catalyst, the once red jeweled ring that was now the deepest of purple. Mistress, can you tell me about this? He held out the darkened jewel so that it caught the light of the fire, drinking in the ruddy light as if it longed for nothing else but to return to its original shade of red. Soraya looked at the crimson catalyst in the prince's paw for a long time. The silence stretched to the point where they thought she might not answer. Then she set down her mug of wine and smoothed her dress. The crimson catalyst, Soraya said in her silky voice, is supposed to be a bridge between our races. A force of peace, or great destruction if mishandled. A bridge? Felix asked uncertainly. I don't understand what that means. How to explain? Soraya contemplated. Closing her eyes, she took in a deep breath. Then her eyes opened suddenly. I think your food is ready. Perhaps you should eat. Fletch raised up to look into the pot. Then he dipped a ladle into the stew, giving it a swirl. Ah, so it is. You're quite right, he said. Thank the goddess, Fate muttered, edging herself closer to the cooking pot. Would you like assistance? Soraya asked. No. Fletch leaned back and dragged a pile of bowls towards himself. After all, you're supposed to be our guest tonight. Fletch was kept busy, ladling hot soup into bowls for the next few minutes. Fate took hers eagerly. It was full to the brim with bobbing vegetables, and the aroma was incredibly appealing. She quickly dipped her spoon into the stew and promptly burned her tongue on the first bite. Fate exclaimed with frustration. She opened her mouth, quickly letting a blistering hot potato fall back into her bowl with an unceremonious splatter. She breathed in and out quickly, cursing herself as she tried to cool her blistered cheeks. She did not look up from her bowl. She was sure eyes were upon her, but she did not want to draw any more attention to her foolishness. She picked up her mug and took a measured drink, taking the opportunity to glance over the brim to see if it was safe to look up again. Only broth for me, please, Soraya said as Fletch dipped her bowl. Thank you. She took the bowl and held it in both of her long, dexterous hands, gripping the sides and apparently relishing the heat. Edek? Fletch looked up at the drake. Soggy plants do not interest me, Edek sniffed. Fair enough, Fletch added. He let the ladle drop into the pot, then picked up his own bowl. He took a careful sip from his bowl as he sat back down, fishing around with his other paw for his wayward spoon. Slurping, spooning, and smacking were the only sounds heard about the fire for a while, aside from the huge gusting breaths occasionally let loose by Edek. Fate could tell he was less than happy about being left out for dinner, but he would never admit it. She would try and find something for him in the pantry later. She remembered spying a number of cured meats. Although she knew such a meager meal would not be enough for him, he would likely have to find something outside among the slopes to quell his enormous appetite. Regarding your question, Soraya said, let me ask a question in turn. Tell me, what do you know of the Crimson Text? I know the library master gets very annoyed when you use him as pillows, Fletch said casually. Felix grinned from around his spoon. Fate scoffed lightly, but Soraya only looked passively at Fletch, unsure of his sincerity. Fletch cleared his throat. A record of lineage, mostly, from what I could tell, he amended. A few songs and verses here and there, but anything that might resemble a reference to the catalyst seems deliberately obscure, poetical at best. Fletch scratched his jaw. The way they interpret it, they thought the crimson was alive. An odd description for a jewel, if you ask me. Perhaps it was alive, Soraya said coolly. Sorry, but could you be more plain? Fate asked. Personally, she had always thought the Crimson Text to be a curiosity, shrouded too deeply in the mysteries of the past to hold any relevance now. A collection revered by the studious, even if they did not know why. The books you speak of are translations, Soraya said. The early Lightbearers thought it a necessity as the years came and went, and the language of old began to change. Those who could still read the original text began to fade, and they feared the text might be lost forever. So you think the true account of the catalyst has been lost in translation? Fletch mused. That creative liberties were taken by some overzealous scholar who fancied life as a playwright instead of a monk? Perhaps, Soraya said solemnly. However, that does not mean the knowledge is forever lost. She looked at Fletch. You are correct for the most part. The Lightbearers of old thought it important to try and keep track of bloodlines that were most likely to yield results. I'm sure the lineage records were separate at one time, but when the transcripts were rewritten, the records were likely added, even if the scholars were unsure why they were important. Bloodlines that yield results? Felix repeated. Yes, a record of the bloodlines that might become the next Crimson Bearer, Soraya explained. However, eventually that catalog became folly, either due to the rapid expansion of the population, or perhaps complexity of translation, volumes being lost and destroyed to neglect or time. It is no longer trustworthy. If the records are incomplete, does that mean I might not be suitable to be the Crimson Bearer? Felix asked worriedly. What if my bloodline is not the one that can yield results? How can they know? Soraya looked sincerely at Prince Felix. I cannot answer that. After all, I am not a Lightkeeper. Their connection to the light is so intimate. Their ways can seem strange to the rest of us. But I do believe that makes your next course of action obvious. And what would that be? Felix asked, slightly annoyed. Seek out the Lightkeepers and ask them yourself, young one, Soraya said calmly. I have spoken to Fate already and advised her the same. I do not know what ails the Crimson Catalyst, but if you are to be the Crimson Bearer, the Catalyst must be whole. In short, what you're telling me is you really don't know what the Catalyst is? Felix said, dejected. Definitively speaking, no, perhaps not. Soraya placed her bowl on the ground and reached for her mug of wine. She took an extremely long draught, nearly emptying it, all the while gazing at Edek. It is rumored that Scalebloods are descendants of the Elder Drakes. Soraya stood up and reached for the demijohn. Our lineage supposedly tracks back to those Drakions, and in turn they were supposedly conceived by the light, the first creatures to walk this land, brought to life by the Lightkeepers. Soraya moved gracefully among them, pausing to refill each of their mugs before moving on. Regardless if you believe that to be true, one thing is true. It is that Scalebloods can, inherently... Soraya paused and emptied the last of the wine into Edek's bowl. Or maybe I should say, instinctively understand the Keeper's speech. She put the demijohn aside and returned to her place by the fire. The original Crimson texts were full of such words, written in their tongue. What? Fate exclaimed as she looked accusatorially at Edek. You never told us you could understand the Keeper's tongue. I do not know how, Edek said flatly. But... Fate looked between Edek and Soraya, confused. I said it's instinctual, Soraya explained. Not exactly easy to do. It takes extensive time, years even, to condense an instinctual feeling into a coherent word. That institutional knowledge has been passed down through my brood, and we have accumulated many words and added what knowledge we gleaned to help unravel the Keeper's tongue. Okay then, what sort of words did your brood pass down to you, Edek? Fate asked, looking to him curiously. None, Edek snorted. My upcoming was different. Oh, Fate said in a small voice. Not all know the blood of their brood. Few are as lucky as I was, Soraya confessed. I knew not only my sire, but his sire as well. Scalebloods live longer than any other people of Landor. So, by that fact alone, our histories span a longer reach than most. When I was young, I would listen to the stories my great sire would tell. I loved to listen to him speak. It was a great honor, and I would sit for hours listening to his stories. And he had many stories. Soraya's head turned slowly towards Fletch. Some stories spoke about red ones from the sea, a people searching for new lands amongst the waves. Felix perked up. Do you mean the Foxian migration? Soraya smiled. Other stories spoke about mighty hunters from the mountains. They brutalized the land before they eventually learned to live as part of the land. The Owling Winter, Felix supplied again, looking around excitedly. The northern mountain tribes. Soraya continued once more. And then there were stories concerning the excavation of colossal trees and the tunneling of great winding burrows. Upkeep, Uphaven, Felix answered once more. Fate and Fletch were looking at the prince with raised eyebrows. What? The prince said in defense. The library was really good at the capital. Soraya nodded. As you say, some of our histories seem to align with one another. But not only did my great sire tell me about Landor, he also told stories steeped within the depths of time. Soraya's voice became mysterious. Legends from before the Burrokin called this land theirs. Stories, he said, his grandsire had told him. Tales of the elder drakes, the Drakions of the first brood, great scalebloods of tremendous power that governed the world with their majesty alone. Soraya looked around fondly at the room. Supposedly there was Eulfran the Kind, and her mate Virgil the Sturdy, Temptress the Fury, and Taranon the Giver, Cinderin the Fickle, and Alamorn the Cruel, and lastly Emberkin the Bold. Wait a tick! Eulfran? Fate cut in, her voice excited. Are you insinuating that the waters are remnants of one of these Drakions? Perhaps. Soraya laughed. She shook her head, making her long silvered hair whip out. Or perhaps a namesake is just that. Who can really know? However, one story was very important to my great sire, and he told it often. A cautionary tale for the rambunctious youth, no doubt. Soraya's smile was radiant for a moment. Lost in memory's embrace, she unconsciously ran her hand down the length of her tail wrapped around her. Then she seemed to come back to herself and continued. The tale was about Alamorn the Cruel. Alamorn was amongst the strongest of the Drakions. His power was such that no one could stop him from taking what he wished, and he became consumed by greed. More and more he demanded, never to be sated. And who could resist him? But Alamorn made the great mistakes of tyrants. They misjudge those whom they oppress. The young world soon turned against him, lashing out in fear and desperation, not only at him, but the other Drakions as well, with rampant prejudice. The Burrokins, who had lost the most to Alamorn, banded together with fox and wolf alike, a desperate alliance seeking an end to Alamorn. They went to Emberkin, who had befriended the wolves of the north, and demanded justice for the devastation his brother, Alamorn, had levied against their world. Emberkin took pity on their plight and agreed to help. With the strength of Emberkin, and by sheer force of numbers, Alamorn was brought to heel. He was torn down and banished. As penitence for Alamorn's treachery, the other Drakions agreed to go into exile. Their like has not been seen in the world ever again. To make lasting amends for the wrongs done by his brother, Imberkin made the Crimson Pact with the Burrokin, and he gave himself to them, the Crimson Catalyst, a lithium crystal of flame. Flame? Fate squeaked. Hold on, are you saying he gave them a way to perform fire techniques? But that's impossible. Lightbearers have never been able to control fire. It doesn't react to light at all. Yes, flames, Soraya confirmed. Fire is the most primal of elements, the great equalizer, for all beasts fear it. It creates light. It is of the light. Imberkin entrusted himself to the first Crimson Bearer, so that they might be the equalizer, a bridge to span whatever fractures would appear upon the world. Fate was rubbing her temples with her fingers, obviously overwhelmed. Fletch had reclined into a relaxed pose. He was seemingly more interested in thumbing some tobacco into his handsome pipe, but his ears were sharp with attentiveness. Felix, however, was rigidly leaning in close to Soraya, nearly falling over the fire, listening to her every word. But how am I supposed to control this power? Felix asked. If fire techniques don't exist, how am I to change anything? Flames are the essence of change, Soraya said softly. But without will, change can never manifest. Dwell upon this, young prince, and you may learn what Imberkin gave at the first Crimson Pact. If you are to be the Crimson Bearer, then you must become the Catalyst. The cave went silent, except for the fire, which seemed to crackle and spit abnormally loud. A few logs collapsed under their dwindling weight that sent a flurry of red twisting sparks into the air. Fate looked into the heart of the flames, her mind enthralled with the Imberkin legend. She was warm, her belly was full, her head swam in a comfortable way. She could almost feel herself being drawn into the flames. Suddenly, Fate yawned, her whole body quivering slightly, and it ended with an involuntary squeak. This drew a soft chuckle from Fletch. No truer words have ever been spoken, Fletch said, turning towards Fate with a smile. He stood up, tucking his pipe away. I beg your pardon, Lady Soraya. It has been an abnormally long day. I think we should retire for the night. Yes, the hour has grown late. Soraya stood up as well. Be at ease here, and know that you may sleep without fear or watch. Fletch offered a paw down to Fate. She screwed up her face. She wanted to hear more from Soraya now that they had gotten her to open up. Fate considered slapping his paw away, but instead she grabbed it briefly and pulled herself up. It was a good thing she had hold of him after all, for when she rose, her head gave a dizzying spin, and she swayed on the spot for a few seconds. Felix was still sitting, twisting the crimson catalyst between his fingers, the dark purple ruby drinking in the firelight. Once Fate had steadied herself, she let go of Fletch's arm and walked towards her expectant alcove unassisted, with only a step or two outside the mean. Fate pushed apart the heavy curtain of her alcove. The mattress awaited her with a siren's song. She unceremoniously pushed her clothes and the excess gear from the stone slab onto the floor. It hit with a loud clatter. Oops! She giggled to herself. Then she unfolded the mattress and set it in the grooved slab. Snatching the pillow to her, she squeezed it with relish as she collapsed onto the mattress. But something seemed wrong. Her cloak had somehow managed to find its way onto the floor with the rest of her gear. Fate grumbled as she pulled the unwilling garment from under the detritus and spent her next few lifetimes trying to get the thing to cover her properly. Finally, Fate said, exasperated, as the cloak settled over her. It's so quiet, she thought to herself. Being alone was strange after spending so many nights in company with the others. The silence was deafening. She sighed a heavy sigh. Fate reached out and twitched aside the heavy curtain to peer beyond it. She had half a mind to pull the mattress out next to the fire, where Edek would be staying the night. Fate saw that Felix had gone from the fireside, but Soraya was still there. She had seated herself a polite distance away from Edek, and was obviously engaging with the drake. Fate watched curiously. Every so often, Soraya would dart her head a certain way, which would whip her silver hair out to the side, or her tail would give the smallest of twitches. Even more seldom, Edek's low rumble would reach Fate's ears, but his muffled words were unintelligible. "What I wouldn't give to be a bird nestled in that fur," Fate thought. But drakes didn't have fur, she corrected herself. Okay, what I wouldn't give to be a yawn rudely interrupted that line of thought. It was so strong she thought she might squeak again. Careful. I hope nobody heard. That was so embarrassing. She had to muffle the third blasted yawn in the depths of her pillow. They would just make fun of me again. Fate passed into a heavy sleep and did not wake again for the remainder of the night. Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hall. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.